By May 1945, the war in Europe ended. As London crowds celebrated the German surrender, Allied forces shifted their entire military apparatus toward the Pacific. The war against the Empire of Japan was operating on a scale of staggering attrition. In the final 12 months alone, the United States sustained nearly 1 million casualties. The closer American forces pushed toward the Japanese mainland, the steeper the cost became. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese defenders fought with an intensity that resulted in nearly total casualty rates, offering a grim preview of what a full-scale invasion of Japan would look like. In Tokyo, the civilian economy was in ruins, and the merchant fleet was decimated. Yet the Japanese war cabinet remained firmly deadlocked, split 3-3 on the question of surrender. The Japanese military favored a strategy of deliberate bloodletting. By forcing a final, catastrophic battle on the home islands, they believed they could inflict enough Allied casualties to negotiate a peace preserving their imperial system. This political deadlock in Tokyo left Washington with a narrow set of choices. It moved the secret work of the Manhattan Project from the periphery of military planning to the center of a strategy aimed at breaking Japanese resolve without a mainland invasion. That work was massive in scope. At a cost of $2 billion, the Manhattan Project employed 125,000 people under the scientific direction of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. They successfully developed 2 viable weapon designs. Little Boy relied on a gun-type fission mechanism using enriched uranium, while Fat Man used a complex implosion system to compress a plutonium core. A special target committee established strict criteria for their use. They sought urban areas larger than 3 miles in diameter that housed significant military facilities. They also required cities that had been spared from conventional firebombing, allowing scientists to accurately measure the atomic blast damage. Several scientists on the project petitioned for a non-combat demonstration to force a surrender. Military leaders rejected the idea, fearing the experimental weapon might be a dud and worrying the Japanese might move Allied prisoners of war to the test site. They concluded that a scheduled demonstration would lack the psychological shock needed to break the Japanese cabinet. Following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman assumed the presidency. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding unconditional surrender and threatening prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government issued a response translated as mokusatsu, choosing to ignore the ultimatum. By August, the billions spent and lack of diplomatic progress converged. American strategy shifted to combat deployment, prioritizing immediate technological shock over negotiation. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay departed Tinian Island carrying the uranium weapon Little Boy toward Hiroshima. In his diary, President Truman noted that the target would be a purely military one. Hiroshima did house an important army depot, but it was also a dense urban center populated by hundreds of thousands of civilians. As the weapon fell, its internal firing mechanism activated. A conventional explosive propelled a uranium bullet down a barrel and into a set of uranium target rings, achieving critical mass in a single millisecond. The bomb detonated 580 meters above the city. The resulting 13-kiloton explosion killed approximately 80,000 people within the first 24 hours. Hiroshima housed a substantial military garrison of 24,000 troops. However, when the smoke cleared, roughly 90 civilians. The engineering was surgical, but the impact was absolute. The strategic power of an entire bombing campaign was now contained within a single aircraft, capable of erasing an entire city in seconds. 2 days later, the strategic landscape shifted again. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, eliminating any remaining hope in Tokyo that Moscow might broker a negotiated peace. Despite the dual shock of Hiroshima and the Soviet invasion, the Japanese cabinet remained deadlocked. On August 9th, the United States launched its second historic mission, carrying the plutonium bomb Fat Man toward Nagasaki. Detonating with a yield of 22 kilotons, the weapon destroyed 2.6 square miles of the city. Although the surrounding hills successfully shielded portions of Nagasaki, the blast still killed 39,000 people in the very first minute. The scale of these simultaneous catastrophes finally broke the political stalemate. After surviving a sudden military coup attempt, Emperor Hirohito personally intervened, directing his government to immediately accept the Allied terms. The combined devastating force of 2 atomic strikes and a massive Soviet offensive left Japan with absolutely no military recourse. The emperor announced the surrender, and the formal signing on the deck of the USS Missouri officially brought World War II to a close. For the survivors, known as hibakusha, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long-term crisis. In Nagasaki alone, another 70,000 people died over the next 5 years from injuries sustained in the attack. Among immediate victims, 77% died from severe thermal burns, 16% from the kinetic blast wave, and 7% from acute radiation sickness. These injuries were immediately compounded as blasts decimated local hospitals, leaving survivors exposed to malnutrition and untreated wounds. In the decades since, historians have sharply debated the deployment of these weapons. Supporters argue the bombings were a harsh military necessity that prevented a mainland invasion, saving millions of lives, and established a deterrent that secured the long peace. Critics counter that Japan was already on the verge of collapse, making the bombings an unnecessary war crime. They argue the Soviet entry was the true catalyst for surrender, and that using atomic weapons risked a future nuclear holocaust. On the flight back from Hiroshima, Manhattan Project physicist Luis Alvarez drafted a letter to his son. He noted his deep regret over the civilian deaths, but hoped their terrifying creation might force the world to abandon war altogether. Today, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as the first and only times nuclear weapons have been used in armed conflict. They mark the violent conclusion of a global war and serve as a permanent physical warning of what modern science is capable of destroying.